Aaliyah Carter had always been a cautious girl. At 14, she was mature beyond her years, aware of the way the world worked, especially for people who looked like her. Her parents, Marcus and Angela Carter, had instilled in her the importance of being careful, being respectful, and knowing her rights. She understood that, even though she had never done anything wrong, she could still be treated as a suspect just because of the color of her skin. That afternoon, as she walked home from school, she kept her usual pace, earbuds in, listening to her favorite playlist. The autumn sun cast a golden glow on the streets, and leaves crunched beneath her sneakers. The air was crisp, the kind of afternoon that made her want to take the long way home. Maybe stop by the bookstore on Main Street. She turned the corner near the small convenience store she sometimes visited for a quick snack. A sudden commotion caught her attention. A man in a dark hoodie sprinted out of the store, clutching something in his hands. Behind him, the store owner, an older white man, was shouting, his face red with anger. The man bolted down the street and disappeared around another corner. Aaliyah barely had time to process what she had just witnessed when the shrill wail of police sirens filled the air. A patrol car screeched to a stop at the curb, and before she could react, the driver's door flew open. "Stop right there," a voice barked. Aaliyah froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with close-cropped blonde hair was storming toward her. His blue uniform seemed too tight over his muscular build, his badge gleaming under the sun. His name tag read D. Turner. She pulled out her earbuds, confused. "Is something wrong, officer?" Turner didn't answer. His piercing blue eyes raked over her, his expression hard and unreadable. He reached for his belt, unhooking his radio. Suspect in sight, black female, early teens, wearing a navy hoodie and jeans. Apprehending now. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. "Suspect? Wait, no, I didn't." Turner advanced. "Hands where I can see them." Aaliyah instinctively raised her hands, fear creeping up her spine. "I didn't do anything," she stammered. Turner didn't listen. In a swift motion, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. The sudden pain made her yelp. "Ow, stop, you're hurting me. Stop resisting," he snapped. Aaliyah tried to turn her head, looking desperately for someone, anyone, who could help. A few bystanders had stopped, their faces filled with concern, but none dared to intervene. "I wasn't running. I didn't do anything." Turner ignored her. He shoved her forward, her small frame barely able to resist his brute force. "You think you're real smart, huh?" he sneered. "Another thug causing trouble. You people are always up to something." Tears burned Aaliyah's eyes. "I'm not a thug. I was just walking home." Turner let out a low chuckle, his grip tightening. "Yeah, sure, I bet you didn't do anything." The next thing she knew, he was pushing her down onto the pavement. Her knees scraped against the rough concrete, and her palms stung as she caught herself. Then came the cold, unyielding pressure of metal as the cuffs snapped around her wrists. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear a woman shouting, "That girl didn't do anything. Let her go." But Turner didn't let go. He grabbed her shoulder, forcing her back to her feet, his fingers digging into her flesh. Aaliyah gasped for air, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening, but it was. And it was only the beginning. Marcus Carter had spent years fighting for justice. As a federal prosecutor, he had built his career on exposing corruption, putting dangerous criminals behind bars, and ensuring that the law worked for everyone. He believed in the system, at least. He had always wanted to believe in it. Until today. Until he received the call that shattered his world. He had been in the middle of an important meeting, discussing a high-profile case with his team when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something told him to check. When he saw Angela's name on the screen, a strange sense of unease crept into his chest. The moment he answered, he knew something was wrong. His wife's voice was shaky, her breaths uneven. "It's Aaliyah," she said. "The police arrested her." The words made his blood run cold. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pause. He simply grabbed his coat and walked out of the room, ignoring the confused glances from his colleagues. By the time he arrived at the precinct, he was livid. The desk sergeant barely had time to greet him before Marcus slammed his badge on the counter. "Where is my daughter?" he demanded. The sergeant, a middle-aged man with graying hair, hesitated. "Sir, where is my daughter?" A door swung open down the hall, and Marcus saw her. Aaliyah sat on a metal bench, her wrists still cuffed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her hoodie was slightly ripped, and there was a nasty scrape on her knee. Beside her stood Derek Turner, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. Marcus stormed forward. "Get those cuffs off her. Now." Turner smirked. She was resisting arrest. Resisting arrest? Marcus's voice was dangerously low. "She's a child. She fit the description," Turner said lazily. "Dark hoodie. Jeans. Near the crime scene. We had probable cause." Marcus clenched his fists. He had dealt with men like Turner before, officers who thought a badge gave them the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. But this was different. This was his daughter. He turned to the sergeant. "Get me the station chief. And get my daughter out of those cuffs." A long silence filled the room before the sergeant finally nodded. Aaliyah was released moments later, rubbing her sore wrists. Marcus crouched in front of her, his eyes softening. "Are you okay, baby?" She nodded, but he could see the fear lingering in her eyes. His jaw tightened as he stood, facing Turner. "You have no idea who you just messed with." Turner chuckled. "I really don't care." Marcus held his gaze. "You will. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot." Marcus had been in many tense rooms before, facing hardened criminals, corrupt officials, and defense attorneys who would do anything to twist the truth. But this moment, standing in a police station, his daughter trembling beside him, felt like something else entirely. It was personal. It was war. The police captain arrived a few minutes later, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Richard Gaines. Marcus had dealt with him before on a few cases. Gaines was the type who liked to keep things quiet, avoid unnecessary headlines. "Marcus," Gaines greeted, his voice gruff. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." Marcus turned to him sharply. "Misunderstanding? My daughter was assaulted and arrested for nothing." Gaines let out a slow sigh. Officer Turner was responding to a reported robbery. "The suspect. My daughter is not your suspect." Marcus interrupted, his voice steady but laced with fury. "She was minding her business, walking home from school, and your officer attacked her. Look at her." Gaines glanced at Aaliyah, whose eyes were still glassy from unshed tears. The bruises on her wrists where the cuffs had bitten into her skin were turning a deep purple. Turner followed protocol. Gaines said carefully, "We had a description. A vague description." Marcus cut in. "And even if she did match, which she didn't, that doesn't give him the right to throw her on the ground like some criminal." Gaines rubbed a hand over his face. "Look, I'll have Ia review the footage." "No," Marcus snapped. "You're going to release the footage. I want everything. Body cam, street cam, security footage, every angle." Gaines hesitated. Marcus took a step forward. "I know how this works. You don't want this going public. You don't want this station to be at the center of a lawsuit. But I don't care about your reputation. I care about my daughter." Turner scoffed from the side. "You really think you're gonna take me down over some brat?" Marcus turned on him, his expression unreadable. "You assaulted a minor, used excessive force, and filed a false report. You think that badge is going to protect you? It won't. Not this time." Turner smirked. "I'm not scared of you, Carter. You should be," Marcus said evenly, "because by the time I'm done, you won't just lose your badge. You'll lose everything." For the first time, Turner's confidence flickered. Just a little. Gaines cleared his throat. "Marcus, let's not escalate this." "Oh, we're past that," Marcus said. "I'll be filing an official complaint with the DOJ. And I'll make sure every news outlet knows what happened here today." Gaines exhaled, defeated. "I'll start the paperwork." Marcus nodded stiffly. "Good. And I want Turner off the streets while this is under investigation." Gaines hesitated again. "Unless you want the public to see you defending a violent, racist cop," Marcus added. Gaines turned to Turner. "You're on administrative leave until further notice." Turner stiffened. "You're joking. Go home, Turner," Gaines muttered. Turner shot Marcus a glare before grabbing his things and stalking out. Marcus finally turned back to Aaliyah, who had been silent the entire time. "Let's go home, baby." She didn't say anything, just nodded. But Marcus knew, this wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus barely slept that night. After ensuring Aaliyah was okay, sitting with her as she showered, checking on her every few minutes as she curled up in bed, he got to work. By the time the sun rose, He had drafted the formal complaint to the Department of Justice. Angela sat across from him at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, her eyes weary. "Are you sure about this? You saw her," Marcus said. "You saw what they did to our baby." Angela sighed, setting down her mug. "I'm scared, Marcus. You know what happens when people fight back." Marcus reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We can't let them get away with this." Angela closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "Just be careful." Marcus nodded, but there was no turning back now. An hour later, his phone buzzed. It was an email from an anonymous source. He opened it, and his heart pounded. Attached was the security camera footage from the convenience store. Marcus clicked play. The black and white footage showed Aaliyah walking down the sidewalk, her hands in her pockets, earbuds in. She hadn't even looked at the store. Then Turner appeared. The moment he spotted Aaliyah, he started walking toward her. He hadn't seen her do anything, hadn't asked any questions, just decided she was guilty. Then came the part that made Marcus grip the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The camera caught everything. The way Turner grabbed Aaliyah without warning. The way he threw her down. The way he laughed when she protested. Marcus's breathing grew uneven. This was it. This was proof. He didn't hesitate. He forwarded the email to 3 different journalists he knew would cover it. By noon, the video was viral. News outlets picked it up instantly. The footage played on repeat on every major network. Social media exploded with outrage. #Justice for Aaliyah began trending worldwide. Protests erupted outside the police station. Crowds gathered, chanting Aaliyah's name, demanding Turner's arrest. And then, just as Marcus had expected, the lies started. A local news station, one known for its pro-police stance, aired a segment calling the video misleading. A former police chief was interviewed, claiming Turner acted within reason. Then came the leaks. Someone, probably the police union, started spreading false reports. They dug up an old school incident where Aaliyah had been involved in an argument with a teacher, twisting it to make her seem troubled. They claimed Turner had mistakenly identified her, and that this was all just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Marcus watched it all unfold with a cold, simmering fury. He turned to Angela. "They're trying to bury this." Angela clenched her jaw. "They won't win." Then his phone rang. The number was blocked. Marcus answered cautiously. "Who is this?" A distorted voice came through. "Drop this case, or else." The line went dead. Marcus slowly lowered the phone. Angela's eyes widened. "Who was that?" Marcus exhaled, his body tense. They just made their biggest mistake. Because now he was all in. The morning after the video went viral, Marcus stood in his office, staring at his phone. It hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Emails, calls, messages from reporters, activists, politicians, everyone wanted a statement. But Marcus wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. Instead, he turned to the screen in front of him, replaying the footage for what had to be the 100th time. Each second of it fueled his rage. The way Turner had grabbed Aaliyah. The way she had cried out. The smug smirk on Turner's face as if hurting a child was just another part of his routine. Angela entered the office, arms crossed. She was still in her robe, her hair unkempt from a restless night. "I just got off the phone with my sister. The news is everywhere. They're comparing it to George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner." Marcus ran a hand over his face. "And they should." Angela hesitated. "Marcus, you know what happens next." Marcus met her eyes. He knew. The backlash had already started. The police union had released a statement, calling the video, taken out of context. They claimed Turner had reasonable suspicion, and that he had been following protocol. But the public wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, their home phone had been ringing nonstop. Some calls were from supporters, people expressing outrage, standing in solidarity. But others? Death threats, racist rants, promises of violence. Angela sighed, rubbing her arms as if suddenly cold. "I'm scared." Marcus walked over, taking her hands in his. "I know, but we can't stop now." She swallowed. "What if they come after you?" "After Aaliyah?" Marcus tightened his grip. "Then they'll learn what happens when you push the wrong man." Angela shook her head, letting out a shaky breath. "Just promise me one thing, Marcus. Anything. Don't let this fight take away the father Aaliyah needs." Marcus cupped her face gently. "I won't, but I have to see this through." Angela nodded, blinking back tears. She understood. She always did. Then came a knock at the door. Marcus turned, his jaw tightening. He already knew who it was. He opened the door to find his colleague, Jonathan Reed, standing there with a grave expression. "We need to talk," Jonathan said. Marcus nodded. "Come in." Jonathan stepped inside, glancing at Angela with sympathy. "It's worse than we thought." Angela frowned. "What do you mean?" Jonathan handed Marcus a file. "They're already trying to discredit you. Someone's been digging through your past cases, looking for anything they can use against you." Marcus flipped open the file. Inside were old court documents, transcripts, cases he had prosecuted over the years. Nothing incriminating, but he knew how this worked. They didn't need something real. They just needed doubt. Jonathan continued, "They're painting you as biased, claiming you've unfairly targeted law enforcement in the past." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. "So they're making me the villain?" Jonathan nodded. "They're desperate." Angela clenched her fists. "That means we're winning." Marcus exhaled, closing the file. "Then we push harder." By noon, Marcus was seated in a news studio, facing a veteran anchor known for his tough questioning. The interview had been scheduled before the threats, before the police union's smear campaign. But instead of canceling, Marcus doubled down. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and the world watching. The anchor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes, adjusted his papers. "Mr. Carter, let's get right to it. Many are calling this an overreaction. They argue that Officer Turner was simply doing his job. What do you say to that?" Marcus's expression remained calm, but his voice was sharp. Was his job to throw a 14-year-old girl to the ground? To ignore protocol? To humiliate and traumatize her? The anchor didn't flinch. The police department claimed she matched the suspect's description. Marcus leaned forward. "And what was that description?" "Exactly? Black girl in a hoodie." "That's not a description. That's a stereotype." The anchor hesitated, but Turner believed. Turner didn't believe anything. Marcus cut in. "He assumed, and that assumption led to violence against my daughter." A hush fell over the studio. The anchor cleared his throat. "The police union also released statements about your history. They claim you have a pattern of going after law enforcement. That this is more about your own agenda than about justice." Marcus's jaw tightened. "My only agenda is justice. And if that means holding officers accountable, so be it." The anchor studied him. "What do you want to happen next?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I want Turner charged. I want a federal investigation. And I want systemic change so this never happens to another child." The interview ended soon after. But Marcus knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected call from the Department of Justice. "Mr. Carter, this is Special Investigator Michelle Evans. We're officially opening an inquiry into the conduct of Officer Derek Turner." Marcus exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "What took you so long?" Evans didn't sound apologetic. "We had to assess the situation carefully. But after reviewing the footage, we believe there's enough to warrant an investigation." Marcus didn't celebrate yet. "So what happens now?" "We'll be conducting interviews, collecting evidence. If we find grounds for prosecution, Turner could face charges. And if you don't?" Evans paused. "Then it'll be up to the public to demand accountability." Marcus ran a hand over his face. He already knew what that meant. If they didn't fight, nothing would happen. Evans continued, "But I need to warn you. The police union is pushing back hard. They're well connected, and they don't want this to go any further." Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. "Then they're going to hate what I do next." Because Marcus had one more card to play. And he was about to use it. The next morning, Marcus and his legal team filed an official civil lawsuit against Derek Turner and the police department. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters as Marcus stepped forward, flanked by his attorneys. "This is not just about my daughter," Marcus said firmly into the microphones. "This is about every black child who has been profiled, harassed, and brutalized by the very people sworn to protect them. And we will not be silent." As the cameras flashed, Turner himself appeared in the distance, surrounded by his own lawyers. His face was stone cold. But Marcus could see it, the fear creeping in. He knew what was coming. And for the first time, so did the world. Marcus sat in his office, staring at his phone as another death threat rolled in. It was the fifth one that day. The police union, right-wing media, and Turner's supporters had turned the case into a battlefield. twisting facts and spreading lies to paint Aaliyah as the aggressor and Marcus as a radical prosecutor with a vendetta against law enforcement. He had been expecting the smear campaign. He knew they would dig through his past, look for any case they could distort to make him seem biased. But what he hadn't anticipated was the sheer ferocity of their attacks. They weren't just trying to protect Turner, they were trying to destroy his family. Aaliyah had stopped going to school. Angela had been forced to delete her social media after an anonymous account posted their home address. The messages were getting more violent. Marcus clenched his fists as his phone rang again. This time, it was Jonathan Reed. They just issued a subpoena for Aaliyah's school records, Jonathan said, voice laced with anger. Marcus froze. What? They're trying to paint her as troubled. Digging through everything, attendance records, disciplinary actions, even her grades. They want to frame her as some delinquent who deserved what happened. Marcus closed his eyes, fury boiling beneath his skin. His daughter, a student, a child, was being put on trial in the court of public opinion while the real criminal walked free. We have to stop this, Jonathan continued. Marcus exhaled sharply. We will. But first, I need to make a call. Outside the police department, the protests had swelled. What had started as a few dozen people had grown into thousands. The footage of Aaliyah's arrest had ignited a fire across the country. Activists, civil rights leaders, and even celebrities had spoken out, demanding justice. Angela stood among the crowd, microphone in hand, her voice unwavering. My daughter was brutalized by a man who swore to protect and serve. And instead of accountability, they attack her. They dig into her past. They try to paint her as a criminal. But we know the truth. And we won't be silent. The crowd roared in agreement. Signs waved through the air. Justice for Aaliyah. No more racist cops. Black Lives Matter. But across the street, counter-protesters had gathered. A sea of blue flags and back the blue banners. They jeered. They shouted slurs. Some even carried guns. Angela spotted them but didn't falter. She refused to let them intimidate her. Then, a sudden bang echoed through the crowd. Screams erupted. People ducked. Panic rippled through the protesters. Marcus, watching from a distance, felt his heart stop. Angela, he shouted, pushing through the crowd. But when he reached her, she was still standing, shaken but unharmed. The sound hadn't been gunfire. It had been a firecracker, thrown from the counter-protesters. A warning. Angela turned to Marcus, eyes blazing. They think they can scare us. Marcus shook his head. They want us to react. To make a mistake. Angela took a deep breath. Then faced the crowd again. We will not be afraid, she declared. The protesters roared in agreement, their resolve stronger than ever. But Marcus knew this was far from over. Late that night, Marcus sat in his home office, reviewing documents when his phone buzzed again. Another anonymous email. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was another threat. But when he finally opened it, he froze. The subject line read, "You're not just fighting one cop." Attached were leaked police records. Marcus's hands trembled as he scanned the documents. They detailed multiple complaints against Turner, not just for excessive force but for cover-ups. Cases where Turner had falsified reports, tampered with evidence, even coerced witnesses. And every single time, the department had protected him. This wasn't just about Aaliyah. Turner had a history of violence, and he had been shielded. Marcus's blood ran cold. He had suspected corruption. But this was a systemic cover-up. His mind raced. Who had sent this? A whistleblower? A rogue officer tired of the corruption? Whoever it was, they had just given Marcus everything he needed to bring Turner, and possibly the entire department, down. But the question remained. How far were they willing to go to stop him? As if answering his thoughts, another message came in. This time, it was a video file. Marcus clicked play. The footage was grainy, taken from a security camera outside his house. A dark SUV was parked across the street. The timestamp showed it had been there for hours. Watching, waiting, Marcus's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about Turner anymore. They were coming for him. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He paced his office, thinking, strategizing. He knew what had to be done. The next morning, he held a press conference. Standing at the podium, cameras flashing, he held up the leaked documents. This, he said, voice steady, is evidence of corruption that extends beyond one officer. This department has covered up abuse, protected violent men, and violated the trust of the community. And we are taking action." He turned to the cameras. "I am officially requesting a federal investigation into the city's police department." The reporters gasped. Even Jonathan looked stunned. A federal investigation? That was huge. It meant external oversight. It meant real consequences. And it meant the people trying to silence Marcus had just lost control. But as soon as he left the stage, his phone buzzed. A restricted number. He answered. A voice, low and chilling, whispered, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Click. Marcus lowered the phone, his face unreadable. Angela stepped beside him. "What did they say?" Marcus exhaled, then met her eyes. "That they're afraid." Angela studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then we keep going." Marcus took her hand, squeezing it, because now, there was no turning back. Not until justice was served. The city was boiling. Protests had grown in number and intensity. The streets, once filled with peaceful marchers, were now battlegrounds where activists clashed with counter-protesters, where riot police lined up with shields and batons, where anger and exhaustion had given way to something volatile. Every day, Marcus watched the news, seeing the city he had called home for years unravel. Angela had begged him to take Aaliyah and leave town for a while, just until things settled down. But Marcus couldn't, not when justice was so close. That evening, he met with his legal team in a high-rise office overlooking the city. The room was tense. Jonathan was pacing near the window, arms crossed. Samantha, one of Marcus's lead attorneys, had her laptop open, scrolling through documents, her brow furrowed. "They're pushing back harder than we expected," Jonathan said, running a hand through his hair. "They're pressuring the mayor, the city council, hell, even some judges. They want this case buried before it even reaches trial." Marcus nodded grimly. He wasn't surprised. "And the Department of Justice?" Samantha sighed. "They're hesitant. The police union is lobbying hard, claiming this is a politically motivated attack on law enforcement. They're framing Turner as a sacrificial lamb, and saying an investigation into the entire department would be overreach." Marcus clenched his jaw. "They want to protect the system. They always do." Jonathan turned from the window. "We need more pressure, more public support. The protests are strong, but we need politicians, leaders, someone with power to demand action." Marcus exhaled, thinking. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Carter." A familiar voice spoke. "It's me." Marcus's eyes widened. "Senator Grayson?" The senator had been vocal about police reform in the past but had largely remained silent on Aaliyah's case. "Until now. I saw your press conference," Grayson said. "And I saw the leaks. This is bigger than just one cop. I'm ready to back you. Publicly." Jonathan's head snapped up, listening intently. "You're sure?" Marcus asked. "I am," Grayson confirmed. "I'll call for a full Senate hearing on police misconduct. We'll put pressure on the DOJ. But you have to be ready for what comes next." Marcus already knew what that meant. The war had just escalated. Marcus had learned a long time ago that power doesn't relinquish itself without a fight. The moment Grayson publicly backed the investigation, the attacks on Marcus intensified. The media ramped up its smear campaign. Stories emerged twisting old cases Marcus had prosecuted, claiming he had a vendetta against law enforcement. Anonymous sources spread outrageous lies, that Marcus had coerced witnesses, fabricated evidence, even that he had a secret political agenda. But then, things got worse. That Friday, Angela found a small black box in their mailbox. No return address, no markings. She brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. "Marcus?" Her voice was shaky. "I don't think we should open it." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He grabbed his phone and dialed the authorities, instructing them to send a bomb squad. Within an hour, the police arrived. Technicians in protective gear examined the box carefully. Then one of them turned to Marcus. "It's not a bomb." Relief flooded Angela's face, but Marcus felt uneasy. "Then what is it?" The officer hesitated. "You should see for yourself." Carefully, they opened the box. Inside was a single, bloodied bullet. Alongside it was a piece of paper with 6 chilling words. "Drop the case, or you're next." Angela gasped, stepping back. Aaliyah, who had been watching from the hallway, clutched her mother's arm. Marcus took the note. His expression unreadable. He wasn't scared. He was furious. He turned to the officer. "Get forensic analysis on this. Now." The officer nodded. "We'll check for fingerprints. DNA." Marcus shook his head. "No. Check the police department first." Because he already knew. This wasn't from some random thug. This was a message from within the system. The bullet incident had the opposite effect of what the attackers wanted. Instead of scaring Marcus into silence, it only made him more determined. And it made the nation take notice. The story exploded across the media. A federal prosecutor receives death threats for investigating police brutality. Civil rights groups demanded federal protection for the Carter family. Protesters doubled down, filling the streets in record numbers. And then came the final blow. Another anonymous leak. This time, it wasn't just reports. It was video footage. Not just of Aaliyah's arrest, but of other victims. The files contained dozens of videos of police brutality, cases where officers had planted evidence, fabricated reports, and beaten civilians. Some of the officers were still on duty. And at the center of it all? Derek Turner. Marcus stared at the footage on his laptop. His breath slow and steady. Angela was beside him, watching in horror. Jonathan called, voice breathless. "Marcus, do you know what this means?" Marcus nodded, his gaze locked on the screen. This case just became a national scandal. The DOJ could no longer stall. The mayor couldn't ignore it. The entire country was watching. And Marcus? He was ready for the final battle. The next morning, Marcus held a press conference outside the courthouse. A sea of cameras and microphones pointed at him as he stepped up to the podium. Angela stood beside him, holding Aaliyah's hand. Marcus took a breath, then spoke. "For weeks, we have fought for justice. And for weeks, we have been met with resistance, lies, and threats. But today, that ends." He held up a flash drive. This drive contains evidence of widespread police corruption. It proves that Derek Turner was not a bad apple. He was part of a system that protected abusers while targeting innocent civilians, especially people of color. The crowd murmured. Reporters scribbled furiously. Marcus turned to the cameras. "I am officially calling for the indictment of Officer Derek Turner on charges of assault, falsifying reports, and abuse of power. And I am demanding that every officer involved in these cover-ups be held accountable." Cheers erupted, but Marcus wasn't finished. "This isn't just about my daughter," he continued. "This is about every victim who never got justice. Every name we've had to march for. Every family that was torn apart. No more. We demand real change, and we won't stop until we get it." The roar from the crowd was deafening. That night, Marcus received a call from the DOJ. "Mr. Carter," Michelle Evans said, "we're moving forward with federal charges against Turner. The grand jury convenes next week." Marcus exhaled, his body finally relaxing. "Good." Evans hesitated. "But there's more. The city's police chief just resigned. The mayor is considering a full department overhaul." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The tide was turning. He hung up and turned to Angela. "It's happening." Angela let out a breath, tears glistening in her eyes. "We're winning." Marcus nodded. "We're winning." But he knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The courthouse was suffocatingly silent as Marcus sat at the prosecutor's table, waiting for the grand jury's decision. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down on everyone inside. Angela sat in the first row behind him, her hand firmly gripping Aaliyah's. Jonathan sat beside Marcus, his face unreadable, but Marcus could see the flicker of nerves in his eyes. Derek Turner sat across the room, flanked by his attorneys. He looked different now, his usual smugness replaced by something closer to fear. He had expected to be untouchable, expected that the system, the same one that had protected him for years, would continue shielding him, but things had changed. The grand jury had spent days reviewing the evidence, the police brutality videos, the internal reports, the damning testimonies from former officers who had finally decided to speak out. It was overwhelming. Even the strongest blue wall of silence had begun to crumble under the weight of the truth. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Then came the words that would change everything. After reviewing the presented evidence, the grand jury finds sufficient grounds to proceed with formal charges against Derek Turner on counts of aggravated assault, falsification of reports, and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and then cheers from the gallery. Turner stiffened, his jaw tightening as his lawyer whispered something to him. But Marcus barely spared him a glance. Instead, he turned to Angela, who had tears in her eyes, and Aaliyah, who looked both relieved and overwhelmed. They had won this battle. But the war wasn't over. Because now it was trial time. The trial of Derek Turner was unlike anything the city had ever seen. It was more than a case, it was a reckoning. Every major news network covered it. Protesters camped outside the courthouse. Some called for justice. Some still clung to the lie that Turner was a good cop, being unfairly targeted. But the world was watching. Marcus sat at the prosecution table, leading the charge. The city's district attorney had offered to handle the case. But Marcus refused. This was personal. Turner's defense team tried everything. They blamed stress and split-second decision-making. They claimed Aaliyah had acted suspiciously, and that Turner had feared for his safety. They even tried to frame it as a case of misunderstanding rather than malice. But Marcus dismantled them piece by piece. The footage was undeniable. The pattern of abuse in Turner's history was clear. And when Aaliyah took the stand, her calm but powerful testimony silenced the entire courtroom. "I was just trying to go home," she said, voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "But he didn't see a girl. He saw a suspect. He saw someone guilty before I even said a word." The final nail came when a former officer from Turner's own precinct took the stand. "I was there," he admitted. "I saw Turner do things like this before. I was too scared to speak up. But not anymore." Turner's face was pale. He knew. When the jury left to deliberate, the world held its breath. When they returned, the words rang out like thunder. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." Angela sobbed in relief. Aaliyah gripped her father's arm. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of victory settle over him. Justice had been served. Turner was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The ruling sent shockwaves through law enforcement. It wasn't just about Turner, it was about what came next. Suddenly, more officers came forward. More lawsuits were filed. The police department was forced to undergo sweeping reforms. The city council introduced new policies, stricter accountability measures, independent oversight, the defunding of corrupt police initiatives. But Marcus wasn't finished. He used the momentum to push for federal police reform. With the help of Senator Grayson, a national police accountability bill was introduced in Congress. Some fought it hard. The police unions, the conservative lawmakers, the people who wanted to maintain the status quo. But the people had woken up. Protests turned into policy changes. Cities across the country started reviewing their own police forces. Departments that had hidden brutality for decades were finally exposed. This was bigger than Aaliyah now. This was a movement. A year later, Marcus stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed audience at a civil rights summit. "This fight isn't over," he said. "Justice isn't a moment, it's a commitment. We can't erase the past. But we can shape the future. And we will." The crowd erupted in applause. In the front row, Angela smiled at him, pride shining in her eyes. Aaliyah, now 15, sat beside her, stronger than she had ever been. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor, a symbol of resilience. As Marcus stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan. "DOJ just announced a nationwide police misconduct task force. We did it, Marcus." He exhaled slowly. They had won battles. They had forced change. But he knew the truth. The fight for justice never truly ended. And he was ready to keep fighting. No matter what.